In this lecture, I will show you how to use aggregate demand and aggregate supply model to explain economic growth, unemployment, and inflation. Before we go there, let me show you a connection between potential GDP and real GDP. Remember, potential GDP is our long run aggregate supply. And in this graph, what I'm showing you is the potential GDP and the real GDP in real terms. So this blue line is the potential GDP or long run aggregate supply. Now what potential GDP measures? It measures how much the economy is capable of producing at a point in time, given that we are utilizing all our available resources. On the other hand, what actual GDP is showing is that how much we are producing at a particular point of time. And actual GDP is the red line here. So this red line is the actual GDP. And we can see that in some years, your actual GDP is above the potential GDP, or in some years, your actual GDP is below the potential GDP. Now, one of the biggest recession we had since the Great Depression of the 1930s was the 2008 financial crisis. You can see how our actual GDP is way below the potential. And when it's below the potential, which means that we are underutilizing our resources, which essentially means that we had a lot of facilities which were closed, which we were not using despite the fact that we could potentially use it, which essentially means that a lot of people without jobs. On the other hand, we have situations when actual GDP is above the potential GDP, and you can see here in this part your so in this case your actual GDP is more than potential GDP. Now what does it mean? That means we were overutilizing our resources, which essentially means that a lot of people were working overtime. People were working more than 40 hours a week to produce those goods and services. So in a real world, what we want to be the case where actual GDP should be equal to your potential GDP. Below the potential is not good, above the potential is also not good. And we'll try to explain all this using an aggregate demand and aggregate supply curve. First, let me show you how to explain economic growth using aggregate demand and aggregate supply curve. So let's first draw a long run situation. And remember, long run situation where all the three curves, which is short run aggregate supply, long run aggregate supply, and the aggregate demand are intersecting together. So this Y star is our potential GDP, which the economy is capable of producing, given that we are fully utilizing our resources. And then let me show you the aggregate demand curve. And this is your long run equilibrium. And what is a long run equilibrium? It's where all the three curves are intersecting together. Now obviously we saw that economy do not stay in the long run. It's sometimes above the long run or potential GDP, or sometimes below the potential GDP. So let me show you a case when we have a recession. Let's assume that your aggregate demand curve has shifted left. And remember from the last lecture, when aggregate demand curve shift left, it because of the factors such as consumption, investment, net exports, or government expenditure has to decline. Let's say for some reason people were not feeling very confident about the economy. As a result, consumption decline, and when consumption declines, your aggregate demand curve shifts left. So this is a left shift of the aggregate demand curve. And aggregate demand curve shifted left to AD1. As a result, what happened? Our new output is here, new equilibrium is here, and economy is producing at Y1. So we are now below the potential GDP. So at this point, we are below potential GDP. Now, essentially, what does it mean? We are having a decrease in economic growth because our GDP is declining because of left shift of the aggregate demand curve. On the other hand, suppose for some reason government comes in and they say, hey, we want to spend money to help the economy. So government can come in and they can start spending money. Moment they start spending money, your aggregate demand curve will shift to the right. Let me show you this. So AD3, which is after G increase. G is your government expenditure. So it kind of here. So your new equilibrium is Y2. Now we again started seeing an increase in GDP. Moment GDP increases, that's positive economic growth. So always remember, when GDP decreases, it can be because of left shift of the aggregate demand. At the same time, I can show you this can also be because of left shift of the aggregate supply. So whatever reason your GDP is decreasing, it will lead to a decrease in economic growth. On the other hand, when GDP increases, it leads to increase in economic growth. Now let me show you a case where left shift of the short-run aggregate supply is causing a decrease in GDP. Now this can happen. Remember, your short-run aggregate supply can shift left because of increasing input prices, decrease in productivity, or change in input goods like labor. Now let's say there's an oil shock, which essentially means that oil prices has gone up, cost of production increased, so farms are becoming less profitable, so they will produce less. In this case, we'll have a left shift of the short-run aggregate supply. So this is a left shift of the short-run aggregate supply. So your aggregate supply shifted left. As a result, we reached equilibrium here, which is even a further decrease in GDP. So GDP can increase or decrease due to shifts of both aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply. If either aggregate demand or short-run aggregate supply shifts left, it will lead to decrease in GDP. On the other hand, if aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply shifts right, it will lead to increase in aggregate demand. And as a result, you're increasing GDP. Now let me show you unemployment in aggregate demand, aggregate supply diagram. Again, we are starting off with a long run equilibrium, which is where 3 points or three curves intersect together. Now let me go into details of this long run or potential GDP. So Y star is our potential GDP, which means that we are utilizing all our resources, which also means that our unemployment as natural rate of unemployment, natural rate of unemployment, which essentially means approximately 5% unemployment. Now, we all know that from the unemployment chapter, always certain people are without jobs because of transition. What economists have figured out, on an average, 5% of the labor force are without job. So it's perfectly okay in an economy at potential GDP to have around 5% unemployment rate, because it is a natural rate. So this potential GDP, also known as natural rate of output, natural rate of output, that's another term we use for potential GDP. So potential GDP is the GDP at which unemployment rate is at natural rate, which is around 5%, which is also called natural rate of output. Now let's see what happens if there's a left shift of the aggregate demand, say due to decrease in investment. Suddenly investors thought that economy is not looking good, so they reduce investment. If investment reduces, your aggregate demand curve shifts left. Your aggregate demand shifts left to here. So what's our new equilibrium? This is our new equilibrium or new short run equilibrium, where our new GDP is Y1. Now since Y1 is less than Y star, so Y1 is less than Y star, which implies that unemployment is greater than natural rate. And again, natural rate is 5%, which means that unemployment rate is typically more than the 5%. Now why it's happening? Because if we are producing below the potential, which means that we have resources which are underutilized. When resources are underutilized, which essentially means that we are not utilizing all of our labor force, which essentially means that a lot of people are without jobs. So whenever your GDP decreases, unemployment increases. So Y decrease implies unemployment increases. Next, I'm going to show you inflationary pressures in aggregate demand, aggregate supply diagram. Again, I'll start with a long run situation. I'll draw the potential GDP, which is also long run aggregate supply, and Y star is our potential GDP or natural rate of output. And then I'll draw the aggregate demand curve. Now let me first show you a inflationary pressure due to left shift of the short run aggregate supply. Suppose again there's a hurricane, and as a result production process stopped because factories got destroyed. As a result we can't produce enough. As a result, say your short run aggregate supply shifting left. Is a left shift of the short-run aggregate supply. As a result, we reach a new short-run equilibrium here, at out. Now let's compare the prices. Let's start with the initial prices. So initially price was here at P star. After the new equilibrium, short-run equilibrium, prices moved up here. So what you can see here, because of left shift of the short-run aggregate supply, prices increase. And when prices increase, what we call is a inflation. So left shift of the short-run aggregate supply will cause a inflationary pressure. So this is inflationary pressure caused by left shift of short-run aggregate supply. Similarly, inflationary pressure can also be caused by right shift of the aggregate demand. For whatever reason, if your aggregate demand shifts right, let me show you here. So your aggregate demand shifted right. As a result, what happened to prices? Prices even increased even further. Prices increased even further to P2 to here. So this increase in price inflationary pressure caused by increase in aggregate demand, which is a right shift of the aggregate demand, increase in demand. So what I'm just showed you that how we can use a simple aggregate demand, aggregate supply model to explain changes in the economy, especially economic growth, unemployment, and inflation.